Okay.
Great. So I'm very pleased to introduce our second and last speaker before lunch today on our second day. So Francesco Di Giovanni has been working on, deep learning and metric geometry. And so we're going to hear about metric flow matching today.
Hi, so I have a bunch of disclaimers. First of all, I will not be preaching to the choir most likely today. So the reason is like, okay, I will share maybe a background on my personal journey, because I feel like if, back in the day when I was a PhD student, I would have appreciated that. So my PhD was in actually Riemannian geometry. So yeah, manifolds, continuous stuff, restrictive flow. But then I got like, I want to do something else. So I think over the last 3 years, I have worked on graph machine learning. So actually problems like that we've seen before, like homophily, I did work a little bit on that from the point of view of graph neural networks. Also on higher order networks for machine learning, like shift neural networks and stuff like that. But like every 3 years, I kind of periodically enter like a period of crisis. So I decided to change. And this is what I will kind of talk about today. So I'm mostly nowadays working in generative modeling, but like I've actually joined Valence Labs, so I have quite a bit of an eye towards like drug discovery and applying machine learning for physics simulations. But generative modeling is kind of like most likely the ingredient. Maybe out of curiosity, how many people here have heard of or know of diffusion models, flow matching? Okay, not as many as I hoped for, but it's fine. So let's start. So first of all, the slides and the work, especially from the experimental side, this was led by Casper, who's a PhD student in Oxford. In fact, this was mostly like an Oxford collaboration and Mila, because of Alex. So I will try to describe what we did, but I will try also to sort of convince you of why this type of approach in terms of like guiding generation models is going to be crucial when we want to move from applications from, yes?
Sorry, I just have a technical comment. Can you please stick in front of the microphone so that we can
Yeah, so I'm Italian, so I tend to move a lot, but I will. No, I will try to do my best. No, then I get embarrassed. I will try to do my best. Okay. What was I saying? Okay, yeah. So how do we move to physics? Sort of how do we kind of like encode inductive biases, especially from physics, into generative model, which is going to be crucial when we move from applications like image generation, where you kind of know mostly nothing about inductive biases, but we have tons of samples, to generate proteins, generate ligands for like protein ligand interaction and things like that. Okay, so but what kind of applications we looked into this project? So it's mostly trajectory inference. So the kind of setup you should have like picture in your mind is like you can observe measurements which are very sparse in time and irregular. So there is no regularity. You can observe some population, you make a measurement, then a couple of days later you make another measurement, and so you have like these sort of sparse populations. And a key applications we actually consider is single-cell RNA sequencing. So I'm not a biologist, so I will tell you like what I know about it from my point of view that was helpful for the paper. So essentially, single-cell RNA sequencing is a very accurate procedure that provides you an embedding of a single cell into the space of gene expressions. So it's super accurate. The problem, what's the catch, is like it's a very expensive procedure, so you cannot like run it as much as you can, and it's destructive. So the cell dies once it's been mapped. So what it means is like if you want to now use single cell, for example, for tracking the evolution of a disease, you're going to get these population observations, but there's not going to be a one-to-one correspondence, because the cell you observed here are not the same ones you will observe later, because those cells died. Okay. Right. So what's the kind of then goal of the problem is we want to essentially infer trajectory dynamics from these sparse observations. And the main reason we want to do that is because we want, for example, to understand how quickly a certain disease is progressing, how it's progressing. So actually what you're seeing here is the 2D projection of the single cell data. These are the trajectories that we reconstruct. And as you can see, the labels, the colors are the days these basically stem cells have been observed. But of course, we want to convince machine learning community, so we want to have multiple applications and say, yes, our framework is cool, look at us, we're good. So we, of course, have to do stuff with images. I will describe this later. Why we ended up dreaming of dogs and cats. Right, so I will try to give you a very quick introduction of essentially state-of-the-art, let's call it that way, generative models in deep learning. I will not really talk about diffusion, but diffusion is actually an instance of what I'm saying, so it's going to be the same thing. But for people that have no idea about that, so diffusion models, flow matching are truly a revolution in the field. So this stuff is impressive, is behind the success of course, if you've ever played with like stable diffusion and image generation, that's the architectures that are behind that. But any type, most of like the tech biosector and the investing they're doing is because they are betting on this type of models to succeed there. So roughly speaking, generative modeling kind of want to solve a very simple, well, at least in theory, a very simple problem, which is you want to map a source distribution P0 to a target distribution P1. And so of course, the classical generative scenario, P0 is a density you can easily sample from, noise, and P1 is a target distribution that represents the objects you can look at. For example, the distribution of images, distribution of text, proteins, and so on. Now, something that is actually like quite relatively old is this idea that you can, mathematically speaking, mapping distributions means you want to find a push-forward map, right? And then kind of like in 2018, people realized that you can, one relatively efficient way, and I'm emphasizing the word relatively here, to do that would be, instead of parameterizing the push-forward map directly, we learn a vector field that pushes particles from the source distribution to the target distribution, and then we integrate this vector field to find in a flow map. Okay, this is what's called continuous normalizing flows. And the way basically now, this more recent framework that mainly Yaron Rickman introduced 2 years ago, called conditional flow matching, tries to improve on what was known. So what was sort of the game changer? So continuous normalizing flows was, mathematically speaking, very nice. So you give me samples, I can describe a density as sort of the push forward of a neural network. I can do sort of like KL divergence, and I train my neural network to sort of maximize the sort of what I can observe. The problem is, like, you can quickly see that if you have to solve a differential equation, each time you have to evaluate the likelihood, it's a pain. So meaning, like, you have to solve, you have to call your numerical solver every time during training, and you have to back propagate through it. So that's what, like, in the sort of generative modeling literature and community, we refer to as simulations. So simulations meaning in training, you will have to solve differential equations and back propagate through the differential equations. So this is something you don't want to do. If you have that in your model, you will not scale to realistic problems. Simulation free means we don't do that. We manage to avoid solving differential equations in training. And essentially, conditional flow matching is a simulation free approach to normalizing flows. So that was the game changer. And the way it basically operates is you sample points x0 from your source distribution, say Gaussian, and you look at the samples x1 from your target distribution, you connect them through a path, and then you do score matching. So basically you learn a vector field V parameterized by your neural network, and you learn this vector field by regressing to the velocities of all of these paths. So basically you are saying where the vector field should point by looking at all your possible samples and connecting to samples from your prior distribution. So as you can imagine, for the sake of time, I'm simplifying a little bit, but to be honest, that's basically it, right? And again, the simple scenario of generative model is P0 is Gaussian. And so once you train the vector field at inference time, you sample a new point from your Gaussian. Now you solve the differential equation. Given your trained vector field for a unit time, what you end up having at the end ideally is a sample from your target distribution. And that's going to be a new image or whatever it is, okay? Now, going back to the trajectory inference problem in single cell, we are not really in the case of source distribution is noise and target distribution is something meaningful. We are actually in the situation where source and target are empirical distributions that describe populations at different times. And we want to connect them, okay? So the way classically conditional flow matching would approach this problem is if you have like source and target distribution, I sample 2 points from my source and target, maybe independently, maybe with some optimal transport coupling, and then I design a straight path, and that's how I connect the two. The issue with that is like, if the data live on a manifold, meaning, for example, the dynamics that is generating this population is actually non-linear, the straight path will most likely be not a good choice. Concretely, what it means is that it's traversing regions of space with no data outside of the physics of the problem. So when we now solve, we sort of apply our machinery, we're going to assign positive likelihood to regions of space that are outside the manifold, outside where the data should actually live. So meaning we are not going to reconstruct the right trajectories, okay? So yeah, this is basically in the literature, at least machine learning literature, this is what was referred to as the manifold hypothesis, which was this idea that like, yeah, you can observe data in a high dimensional space, but actually they live on a lower dimensional space. But actually, in the case, for example, of gene expressions in single cell, there's in a way, a much simpler explanation. Most of the times, these embeddings are very high dimensional. So think of like more than 10,000, the dimensionality of the embedding, but the actual meaningful degrees of freedom are much, much fewer than that. So clearly you don't, this linearity of the ambient space doesn't reflect the meaningful degrees of freedom where the trajectories take place, okay? Okay, so then what's the goal here would be, ideally we want to reconstruct a sort of a trajectory that follows the dynamics. Because if that's the case, then we're going to assign probability to regions of space that are more likely to be traversed by our system, and therefore reconstruct the trajectories a bit better. But of course, what's the catch is like operating on manifolds is a nightmare. Like you don't want to do that, right? So it's like non-linear, there's like you have to do projections, and also like generative models, when there've been several papers exploring this. So if they're trying to sort of regress a distribution defined on a lower dimensional space in a higher dimensional one, they would overfit massively and therefore generalize very poorly. So, and at the end of the day, do we actually know what this manifold is? We don't. At least for single cell, we even like there is no really like, oh yeah, the manifold is actually this one. So you actually don't really know what's the ground truth there. But at the very least, there is a sort of common principle we can adopt, right? The only hope we have is that what we observe in training is roughly a good representation of where the manifold is going to be. Otherwise, why are we doing that this in the first place? So when we draw these interpolants from source to target distribution, these interpolants, the only inductive bias we would like to sort of provide to the system is they should stay close to the samples. They should not stray away from what we can observe, because that's most likely going to be unphysical. It's going to leave the manifold, the data manifold. Okay. Yeah, and in a nutshell, that's what we propose. It's like the general framework is adapting conditional flow matching by learning interpolants that stay close to the sample, so stay close to the data manifold. But we can do that, as you will see in a second, without incurring simulations. Remember, if we do simulations, we are screwed. We can publish a paper, but that's about it. Okay.
Do you care about sparsity? Like what if my points are very sparse?
That's a good question. So can you ask me at the end, because then I will have images, because clearly to an extent that's an implicit, it's something that we have to account for when this framework may work, but please remind me at the end.
Can I also ask a question?
Yes.
Essentially, you're trying to find the geodesic on the manifold.
You're gonna see in a second why this is what we want to do, but why also we cannot really compute geodesics. But that's basically the idea, exactly. So yeah, that's the spoiler, right? So the way what's the equivalent approach? When you talk about like manifolds, we can talk about like changing the ambient space, or we can keep the ambient space fixed, which is Euclidean space, but we can equip the ambient space with a different geometry, which means a different Riemannian metric. And so the way you can do it, because this is like the data are embedded in Euclidean space, concretely, it means that you're gonna essentially define a positive symmetric positive definite matrix to each point in the ambient space. And this is gonna be your norm. So clearly, if that was the identity everywhere, that would be the Euclidean space. But you wanna actually now capture heterogeneity. You wanna capture that certain regions of space should have higher cost because they are outside what you can observe, okay? Okay, that's possible to do. It's relatively simple. I'm gonna show you some explicit constructions later. Now, the idea is if you can find a metric in your ambient space that has, let's say, whose trace, for example, is much, much smaller close to the data and much, much larger away from the data, this metric assigns higher cost, or if you like, higher, like bigger length to paths that are away from the data. Put differently, if you give me such a metric, geodesics, which are the shortest path according to such metric, will always stay close to the samples. Because by construction, I'm basically defining, if you like, a potential on the space that is sort of prioritizing regions of space where you do have samples. These are the regions where you should go. Okay, so geodesics are shortest path, and in a way, that's how I thought about this project in the first place. Like, oh, let's actually, instead of using straight paths, which are geodesics with respect to Euclidean, let's use geodesics with respect to a data-dependent geometry. But the problem, of course, is like, we know, except very homogeneous, nice spaces, geodesics don't have a closed form expression. So if you define an arbitrary metric in the ambient space, you don't know what the geodesics are. So the only way you can compute geodesics is by solving a nonlinear second order system, which are the Euler-Lagrange equations associated with the length functional. Again, these will be simulations because you will have them to solve differential equations numerically during training. And you will have to do it for any pair of points, right? So you don't want to do that. So because we like deep learning, and deep learning kind of works most of the times, okay, let's learn paths that roughly behave as geodesics instead of computing geodesics exactly. And the way we do it is you give me two boundary conditions, x0 and x1. This would be basically x0, say, is a cell observed at time t. x1 would be a cell observed at time t plus k. Now, you consider, first of all, the linear path, so the convex interpolation, and then you add the nonlinear correction. Now, the nonlinear correction, first of all, as a boundary, as a term t times 1 minus t, that guarantees that you recover the boundary conditions, because of course you want to recover the marginals. You don't want to like stray away and do crazy stuff. But then you also have a neural network term that is basically depending on time, the starting and ending point, and additional parameters eta. So I'm going to give a flexibility to the path. Instead of being a straight path, I'm saying, actually, you can learn arbitrary path with this neural network. So what I need now is an objective. So how do I sort of optimize these additional parameters of the neural network correction? And this is where you sort of, you know that geodesics, given a data-dependent metric G on the space, are the minima of the Dirichlet energy, okay? Now, again, finding such minima is complex in general, so the loss we adopt is evaluating the Dirichlet energy over these paths. And then we say, minimize this loss, so learn basically paths that have this form, using this neural network, that are minimal with respect to the Dirichlet energy I'm giving you. Probably we're not going to recover the ground truth global minima, which are the geodesics, but maybe we do good enough. Okay, at least better than the straight path. Okay. Right. So algorithmically, how this works is you have two stages. So the first stage, you learn the path according to your data-dependent geometry. Second stage, you solve the flow matching out of the box. Okay. So what's the first stage going to look like? You sample 2 points x0 and x1 from your like target source and target distributions. Again, say populations of single cell embeddings. You compute your straight path. and then you add your nonlinear neural network correction. So in general, what it means is that you're going to have a path with the same boundary conditions. But of course, if I'm not training, this is just a non-linear path, not necessarily better than the straight one. So that's when we now compute the velocity and plug this velocity into the Dirichlet energy loss. We optimize and we find now paths that sort of avoid those regions of space with no samples, because those regions of space will have a large metric, so large norm of the metric, so will be highly penalized by the loss. And you're going to see in a second what kind of metrics actually achieve that. Okay. Now, there is one simple remark I'd like to make here. This framework quite surprisingly works because typically when you talk about like geometry and stuff, but it works really well. But the reason why I think it works is because this loss is acting on the velocities of the path. So it's a regularization term. So it's preventing basically the path to explode, but it's guiding this regularization according to where the samples are. Okay, so it's important, I believe, that the loss is not operating on the path level, but the velocity level of the path. Okay. Now, once you have this path, you're done. So you basically can use flow matching out of the box, meaning you can now sample a random point along this path, compute the velocity, and regress your vector field neural network to this velocity, meaning that at inference time, the vector field will learn to sort of stay on the samples and not go in regions that are unphysical. Of course, I'm throwing you a lot here, but let's just say again, the framework proposes a first stage of training for learning better paths. The second stage is out of the box. We're not touching the second stage. This is the, yes.
So you're showing a picture just data in R2, right? And
yes.
So for single cell data is 20,000 dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
And then often it's analyzed with multiple reductions.
True.
What dimension is your data that you're actually applying this to?
The experiments I'm going to show you later. So the first dimensionality is low because we needed to compare with baselines, and they all compared on 5. Then we did 100, and now we are training also 1,000. And for what it's worth, we are consistently better than anything out there. But it's like, I'm not sure if in practice, like for single cell, like, you know, again, some of our co-authors are more on the biology side. We're mostly on the machine learning side. So we came up with this framework, and then these people said, we think it could be quite useful for the single cell image analysis. But I think typically, I would like to say, I'm not sure if someone here is more on the biomedical side.
No,
but
I don't care about biology. What I want to know are the numbers, the dimension. I don't care about, I really don't here. What I want to know is, are you looking at, is your vector?
But we do also for images, and images is like way higher dimension than that.
So what dimension?
I would say, I think it's like maybe resolution 64 times 64 times 3 or something like that.
Okay. And so at what dimension are you breaking your method? Like how high dimension and how many samples do you need that? I'm just interested in the numbers.
I don't think it's a matter of breaking I can show you like, I can show you in a second that there are 2 different metrics we look at, which we didn't propose. And one is more suitable for dimension, but I don't think it's a matter of what's the dimensionality that breaks the problem, because once you work for images, you're good for. I think the point is like, which implicit assumptions do you have? Like, where do you expect, which maybe circles back to the sparsity question, like where do we expect this method to work and when it will not work? And I will try to comment on this at the end.
So like you have 1 million samples or like what?
Oh, in this,
I'm just trying to understand the numbers.
I'm trying to see if from the top of my head I remember like for single cell how many samples we have.
Probably less than 1 million.
But definitely less than 1 million. Yeah, it's not like that.
Okay. But with images, you're using some very large database with.
With images, we're using a large. I mean, you're using like something like, which is done in the community, but what's most important, we're using latent spaces and autoencoding. Okay. But that's just because like stable diffusion also operates on latent spaces. So when you want to do something nice for image generation, you want to operate in latent space because it's like that's realistically you don't want to use the full resolution. But what I'm trying to say here is we are tweaking some low level stuff about the generative model of flow matching. Flow matching works in many different scenarios, when you have a lot of samples, when you don't have a lot of samples. There are other type of scenarios where generative modeling in general, like flow matching diffusion models currently break, which is one of the problems, for example, where I'm interested now, which is what if you want to do mode exploration. So if the problem of sampling from the Boltzmann distribution, so like if you don't just want to generate an image, if you want to generate an image, say, you don't care you are consistently collapsing to one mode of the distribution. Yeah, maybe you will pay a price in terms of diversity of images, but it's fine. Now, if you want to now actually access the full distribution because you want to estimate the partition function, then these models are kind of sensitive to what they can observe in training. But that's an issue that I, to an extent, believe we can also fix with that, which is guiding where in training this path should go, besides just collapsing to the samples. But what I'm trying to say here is not just to defend this work. It's like it works in terms of samples dimensionality wherever flow matching, which is the baseline, works, because we're not really touching that kind of optimization. We're mostly just operating on the path level. Yeah.
Let me also ask another question.
Yeah.
So why don't you just start with some curve on the manifolds that you have, and then do some local curve shortening, because you can find geodesics locally within normal coordinates. So it just shorten them between nearby points and iterate that, and then you're sure that you will converge to geodesic.
So we thought about it initially, but then again, in many applications, I mean, maybe if we're talking about this like a mesh you can construct or something like that, but in high dimensionality, like most of the times again, it circles back maybe to the question of sparsity, like why is it working on single cell? Mostly is because when you see a population at time t and a population a later time, there is some overlap between the distributions because of how measurements are taken. So this method at this stage as presented is not leveraging like some underlying ground truth geometry, is simply leveraging this fact that you want to mostly bias because there's more alignment between the tails of the distributions at different times, right? So maybe, I don't know if you were thinking of that, but clearly if you have two distributions which are super localized, super far away in space, this method has very little information on how to guide them. So it's mostly on these distributions having some form of overlap that can guide the path. But like in high dimensionality, I don't think you want to do that in general. Like it feels like there's a little bit too much of an overhead. We want it to be as simple as possible, which is train a neural network with an objective and learn it. That's it.
So you mean you don't have enough data, coming back to those questions?
If you have a lot of data, then you don't need that. That's the point. The more data you have, the less inductive bias you want to give to the framework. So the point of this is when you don't have, we wanted to show that it works for images, okay, because the community cares also about this. But the point is when we want to generate either with certain constraints, we want diversity, we want mode coverage, certain molecules which may be generated are actually not physically possible or are more expensive to generate. So if you want to introduce biases or rewards, that's a different story. But if you have tons of samples, just use diffusion model for matching and that's it. So if the samples are good enough for representing the space, then you're good to go.
As a follow-up to that, one of the things I was thinking about, especially if you have data problems, why not look at like a higher order sampling, right? So you're going from one dot to another. What if I look at, I sample 2 dots, 2 dots, 3 dots, 3 dots, right?
Yeah.
In terms of higher order stuff.
I mean, I agree again, but like
it adds
we had this constraint, like we know what kind of community machine learning we were targeting. Here, efficiency is the key.
Yeah.
We wanted to give, in fact, this method is like less than 2 times lower than the Euclidean baseline because we have this extra thing, but that's it. We're not go higher, which is important. And yeah. Do we, oh no, actually I can check it. Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll skip that because it's not important.
Francesco, because we've stopped you for 5 minutes at least. Feel free. You can go over to finish your talk.
Oh no, I mean if you
It's
stop,
lunch,
you stop me, like I'm cool. Like my fear today was like coming here and people was like, where are the hypergraphs? And so
I told you where the hypergraphs were. So.
and in fact, like it took 25 minutes for people to ask, what about higher orders? No, I'm joking.
So, I mean, the question that I think all three of us are asking in different ways is you're trying to, and this is something we've thought about, specifically for this type of data is building a cover.
Yeah,
And-
yeah,
and
yeah.
that's exactly what you're trying to do in the appropriate way to do it, which is
Mhm.
why I'm asking, what is N, what is D, what is right? Because
Yeah, yeah.
And that's something that maybe we would like to build some
Mhm.
cover, that's some, you know, hyper edge or whatever, right? But that's why I think there's a lot of hypergraphs under the surface.
No, for sure. And maybe, I mean, I don't want to like break the enthusiasm here, but I also want to convey this idea that like the Riemannian aspect here is just addressing. In the real world, I will try to come back to this at the end, what I think is the idea underneath that I hope can be generalized. And as you may have guessed, it's about this: give me an objective given by the physics, maybe an energy, maybe a potential that I want to optimize for, as in where the matching is going to occur in space. And whether that occurs with energy, whether that occurs with like a Riemannian metric, in the end, it doesn't matter. It's what's best for the problem at hand. But it's more this extra flexibility in the generation process. Right, so what about metrics? And actually, it turns out that, of course, there's quite a big literature in graph machine learning, about like constructing Riemannian metrics out of data. To be honest, I'm not an expert into this specific angle of literature, so I will just share what we've used. And I think this is a group from Soren in Denmark. But in general, like, if you give me data and I want to construct a metric that assigns sort of like larger costs to regions outside from the data, you can, for example, just take a sort of like inverse covariance matrix. In fact, again, to come back to the point of efficiency, we just use diagonal matrices in terms of Riemannian metric. We didn't use like crazy dense matrices. And you can see how very quickly, if you give me data, this matrix, this is like the log trace in the y-axis, very quickly and in a very straightforward manner, assigns much higher costs to regions of space where there are no data. So you can quickly understand why, when you now do training, if the path is going through the yellow region, because of the loss we give, would be severely penalized, and it will avoid those yellow regions. So we don't really care, because of the information we have most of the times, about the specific exact path to take. But at the very least, we would like to say, if these are populations take at different times, and we have this type of tail overlapping, maybe it makes more sense to go towards this region rather than in the middle. That's the simple inductive bias we're trying to provide here. Again, when it comes to images, for example, we move to high dimensional problems. We might not want a metric that, for example, depends on any single data point. So we first do a clustering, right? So you can just use a simple like clustering algorithm, and essentially you define the kind of metric you saw before, but based on the centers of the cluster. So you allow yourself a little bit of flexibility when you now go in a high dimensional problem. And that's basically it. I mean, yeah, again, there is a lot that can be done in terms of like refining how the metric is learned. That was not our objective in this paper. It was quite surprising to us that like we took arguably the simplest metric we could find, and it was working out of the box. But of course, there's a lot of room for improvement into like, what if the metric should depend on this? What if I learn the metric based on the task? Again, crucial observation, we never condition the metric on the task, only on where the data are. But that's important because, of course, it means that there's a lot that the framework can grow if you know something about the application. Okay, so let's move to the experiments and visualization. So first things first, the main baseline we wanted to compare with is optimal transport conditional flow matching. So this is like I would say roughly state-of-the-art Euclidean baseline for flow matching. And there's two experiments. So first, we wanted to see, we have to be better than them in the applications we considered. Knowing this, the optimization of the flow matching is the same. The only extra thing we do is, instead of using straight path, we use paths that are optimal with respect to our geometric objective. But the optimization is the same. The way they learn given the path is the same. It's just we change what kind of path we give them. And so these experiments are mostly kind of like to at least try to build an intuition. Upstairs, there is like a 2D synthetic data set constructed with dynamical system. here, this is LiDAR point cloud navigation of some mountain, I think in the US, I don't remember exactly where. But you can see like the straight path, of course, will interpolate in a meaningless way. It's not surprising, but just giving the path the information of stay close to the data where you interpolate is already more meaningful. But of course, in this case, for example, just to give an idea, if I also know anything about height, and if I know any extra information about the application, you can quickly and easily provide them to the metric. But that was not the point of our work. It's not like overfit into an application. Now, dogs and cats. So this application is roughly almost meaningless, I would say. Why the community cares about it is mostly because you want to sort of show if you are able to interpolate from one label distribution, in this case, dogs, to another label distribution, trying to preserve input features. For example, color, mouth open, closed, face orientation, and things like that. Again, what was surprising is that we don't just get better resolution of the Euclidean part, but we do this, there are metrics you can look at, but you have better preservation of some semantic input features. Now, okay, doesn't matter. What matters is latent spaces. So this is something that I was saying before, mostly when you do image generation, because of course companies care about inference time, because inference time means money, is they want to reduce inference time. And one way of doing that, you don't want to operate in the ambient space of images, you want to stay in a lower dimensional latent space. So you use a very powerful encoder model that maps images to a lower dimensional latent space. You generate the image there, and then you decode. So the generation process occurs in a lower dimensional latent space, right? Now, I don't think then it's surprising. It's actually nice to see that our framework does a bit better there, because latent spaces are kind of by definition highly nonlinear objects. Like you basically move from an ambient space using a highly nonlinear encoder operation, and a highly nonlinear decoder operation. So the correct geometry in the latent space is the kind of like the pullback induced by the decoder. So distances in latent spaces should not be Euclidean. And it's kind of nice to see that like accounting for that works. And then, yeah, then we have single cell experiments. So I guess here, something that I should probably emphasize is that how do you assess your performance here? And then you do something quite straightforward, I guess, which is what people, of course, in the community have done, which is leave one out evaluation. So you randomly take every time a population, you remove it from training and test, you compute your trajectories, and then you, for example, you evaluate something like the Wassermann distance between the ground truth population that you left out and the one that was like, is reproduced by your model, by your trajectory. So that's one way of saying how good your interpolation is doing, okay? And yeah, I think after 3.5 years of machine learning, these are the first experiments I'm relatively happy with. Like you see both numbers, most of the benchmarks are kind of pointless, but here it's nice that we could do better than what's out there, at least so far. Yeah, but that's actually even nicer. See why we do better, at least try to give an intuition. So again, the Euclidean part on the left, when it does interpolation, because it uses most of this kind of linear bias, it goes towards regions of space where there are no samples. Most likely they do not correspond to dynamics. And also you have this weird snapping behavior sometimes. Our trajectories are at the very least do what we are hoping to achieve. We don't know what that's exactly, we don't have a real ground truth here maybe, but at the very least they are more smooth and they try to follow the manifold here. Again, these are 2D projections, right? I mean, this is not the real manifold of the single cell embedding. Okay, so take-home messages are fine. I probably want to emphasize something here. So what is, I hinted at that before, but like, what is the ambition more or less here? Forget about Riemannian metric, and it's mostly like this idea that once we move from images, text, so these data modalities where we have tons of samples, to chemistry, biology, and physics, we enter realms where we don't have as many samples, generating samples is extremely costly. Think of generating QM data. You have to define the label, the fidelity, DFT, and then you enter the realm of what kind of DFT do you use and whatever. So you're not going to have that many samples. And at the same time, though, there is something that typically helps you, which is we can leverage what people have been doing in physics and chemistry and so on, which are trying to capture in databases qualitative behavior. So the next step, most likely, or at least that's what I'm hoping for, when we want to deploy these like successful generative models to problems in biochemistry, for example, is we cannot just learn based on the samples you observe. We want to sort of learn both from the physics and the samples. So the key would be, how do we most efficiently encode the physics into the generation process? And this kind of framework is an attempt at saying, maybe we can do that by first learning where the matching in space should occur, and then we can use matching out of the box. Okay, so that's more or less the message I would like to leave here. And yeah, if you have any questions, I'm here.
Yes, very interesting. And I have a question regarding the slide. So practically, where the metric comes from? No, the metric.
Is it the comparison with Riemannian flow matching? This one?
Yes. So my question is, I would like to see this slide better.
Of course.
And where do the metric come from?
Yes.
It comes directly from the data, or we learn that?
So, okay. First, a comment on this slide. Now, the very channel Lippmann, who are the same, some sort of the people behind flow matching in the first place, and they're like super smart. They of course thought about extending flow matching to manifolds. So there is this paper, Riemannian flow matching, right? But of course, like their approach was mostly like, what if the ambient space is a sphere? What if it's a torus? I think they also looked at meshes, but like mostly they looked at either low dimensional settings or scenarios where we're going to enter now a very interesting discussion, and I will try to actually enter it, but like very quickly. So there is a little bit of a bias in the machine learning community, which is when you talk about like sphere, or you talk about, for example, for proteins now, you need SC3 frames. That's actually how AlphaFold operates and stuff like that. You also have a bias towards, if I know the ambient space, I also know the geometry, which is of course not true, right? There are many metrics we can come up with on SU2 or SU3, whatever. So the point is, like, this paper says you can extend flow matching to manifolds, assuming that you know the geodesics of the ambient space, and just use the geodesics as the equivalent of your straight path for training flow matching. And of course, the problem instead in our paper is, what if you don't know what the actual geometry? What if the geometry is coming from high dimensional data? So to come back to your question, I would say we don't learn it. So there is a minimal thing in one of the two metrics we use that is learnable, which is, for example, there's some basically weights of the exponential kernel, but it's very, very minimal. Yeah.
So you were not here yesterday, but I spoke about some practical physics approach with similar things actually, so maybe we can discuss.
Yeah, but like I guess again, something that I'm mindful of is like, most of the times, again, based on the applications, I wonder, is there actually a ground truth manifold, depending on the application? So it's mostly, the metric here was just, we came up with it because it was, we thought about geodesics, and it was like, and what was working looked like it's the way you optimize, which is the way you guide at the velocity level where it should be minimal. And that's what used this sort of heterogeneous norm. That's, I think, what made the framework empirically work. Because people have thought about introducing potentials to guide the path, but it wasn't working as efficient, as well. Yeah.
Technical question, I think slide 23. So this sort of where you said cluster. Is it actually clustering as in sort of proper clustering? Or it looks more like you're sort of doing landmark sampling or like terminal point process based something. Because there's no, I mean,
what do you mean by sampling?
No data in the middle, let's say, of this U shape, right? So and then it says it's a cluster center. So what I mean, so my question is like, what is clustering here meaning? Is it more or less you're trying to get a uniform cover of this, which then would be more like deterministic point process type sampling, landmark sampling, or is it actually clustering as in, I don't know, Gaussian mixture models? Because the cluster centers don't look really like density regions to me.
Yeah, but there's also like, there's a little bit of a learnable, this is the little bit of the learnable component for this metric, which is what we call here W alpha K. So basically, I think we are taking, there are two things going on here. One is the bandwidth. This is what we took from the original paper. It's not learned. There's a certain dependence. I don't remember from the top of my head what we used. But then these weights are actually learned to guarantee some homogeneity. Now, there is actually an interesting question we did debate among ourselves, at least I did debate it among myself, which is, it is actually something that we want the metric to be homogeneous, or we want the metric to be heterogeneous. And I think it's very much, there's a little bit of application sensitivity, but I'm gonna give you the only explanation I could come up with as to why our frame, for now we tried with a more homogeneous approach. Because we're not really solving the geodesic, we are kind of doing pointwise evaluation of the kinetic energy with respect to the metric. If we have like very sharp global minima of the let's say of the trace of the metric, the objective may be skewed towards always going there, even if it's super away from what the path should be looking like. So I thought because we are not actually solving the geodesic, we're mostly doing pointwise evaluation. I thought ensuring, which is what the original paper did in the context of this RBF kernel, ensuring some form of homogeneity is better. But again, you can maybe there are other approaches that might be better. We haven't really like explored this type of angle. It was mostly trying to do as minimal operations at the metric level to see that the idea works, even if we don't tweak it significantly. Yeah.
All right, let's